series on Merton. I was thinking one of the things that Merton does for us is help us to look at life from new perspectives. It seems like one of the things that happens to us is we get into the habit of viewing life always in the same way. Someone has said that habit is really the enemy of seeing in depth. Because we all fall into patterns and routines. There's certain things we notice and others we don't. You know, we focus at sort of a certain level of existence. And it seems as though what we need is to defamiliarize ourselves with things. We have to break up our patterns in order to see things in a greater depth. And Merton helps us to do that. He does it because he views life from the perspective of the monastery, from the life of a monk, from a man who spends all kind of time in solitude. And it also is helpful that way because of his writing style. It's often satirical or overblown or sharp or ironic. And because of that, it seems as though it cuts through our ordinary patterns and suggests other ways of looking at things. Another kind of preliminary remark I would put before you, and that is the distinction between holiness and wholeness. I sort of emphasize that Merton didn't have it all together. I mean, we really see the flaws in this man as we look at him, his lifelong search, his mistakes, his limitations, and so on. And I think there's many ways in which he did not solve the problems of the 20th century. Of course, no one else has either. No, but he's a man clearly in conflict and struggle. He's got things in tension, and he's trying to get them together and so on. So he is not what we would call a totally integrated person. And yet what I would insist is that he's a holy person. Holiness having to do with one's openness to God, one's closeness to the deity, one's modeling of Jesus Christ. I really think of Merton as a holy man, as someone who really struggled in a passionate, deep way to be responsive to the call of God. You know, who wouldn't give up, who was rigorously honest, would never settle for where he was at any point. He was always striving to come closer, to grow in grace and holiness. And so I think of Merton as a holy man, a good man, deep down concerned and so on. Although I have been stressing the fact that he was not a totally integrated man. So I would distinguish those two. There's been a school of thought that has said holiness is wholeness. And I really disagree with that. I mean, some of our great saints in history were hardly balanced individuals. Well, we would not put them up as a model of maturity. Well, a lot of them seem to be rather weird, as a matter of fact. You know, they did strange things. And yet they are called saints, holy, because they've been in this passionate search for God and close to God. So that's a good thing, I think, to keep in mind. In other words, a lot of people who don't really have it together may have a lot of emotional problems and so on, may be very close to God. I think we have to remember that. Okay, now we're dealing with the question at hand tonight, which is put in terms of the conflict between persons and things. There will be a time at the end of the lecture when maybe you'll find out why that was the title. It's taken from a quote of Merton's. But the real emphasis that I have tonight is on personal relationships and how to foster them and how they can bring us closer to God and the kinds of problems and difficulties that we have in personal encounters with other individuals. So as usual, I want to sort of set the problem. I want to put before you, I think, some of the things that Merton wrestled with and that probably we are wrestling with, and allow you to reflect on that a bit, then we'll see if Merton offers us any particular insight on it. First of all is the whole question of the pain involved in personal relationships. The difficulties, the frustrations, the disappointments that go along with our encounters with other individuals. So the question is, how do we deal with those pains and disappointments? What do we learn from them? Are there any ways in which they bring us, that is, the frustrations, bring us closer to God? One of Merton's major points is that we really always end up failing one another. Sooner or later, we don't live up to other people's expectations. Sooner or later, we're not there, tuned in precisely when somebody needs us. Well, and Merton thinks that that really is the root of a lot of the despair in life, because he is passionate about relationships, so passionate very often that he couldn't face up to the problems involved, but he had that deep sense of wanting closeness and wanting intimacy and so on, and very often being frustrated in that. And he thought that is what, if someone is going to despair, get really down in life, that's a good possibility of what's causing it. Failed relationships. He had a tremendous sense, and again, I'm using this for our own reflection, not just him, but the problem of separateness. That is, the inability to connect up with others, the inability to link up, the feeling that maybe one is isolated or not on the same wavelength with other people, or that I'm misunderstood, or I'd like to talk at a deeper level and other people want to talk at a superficial level, or that that one's spouse does not match one's interest in intimacy, that one can't share emotions at the same level that one would like to, so that one doesn't connect in. There's a sense of separation, that one can never get as close as one would like, that intimacy can't be achieved in the same degree that we would like within ourselves. There's also the problem then of loneliness. I mean, that separateness probably leads to a sense of sadness, and it's more sad that can't happen. Though the failure, the fact we fail one another leads maybe to despair or despondency. But then there's a third emotion I would put in front of you, and that is loneliness. It is a feeling that, again, I don't know, I don't have the right words for that, what that does to us psychologically, but to feel alone, desperately alone, or even in more mitigated, moderated ways, to be wanting more people around or a special person around and to not have that, the problem of loneliness. And then there is the inability to communicate. Now, we all know that difficulty. It is at the root problem of many marriage difficulties. People, it seems as though we don't learn that somewhere along the line. A lot of times we don't know how to listen. We like to talk, but don't listen well. So lack of communication would be a difficulty. Some people, I think, have the problem of not being able to juggle all the relationships. That is, there's too many around. I get too many friends, too many relatives, and so on. They always come up short. Well, I'd like to spend more time with this one, get to know this person better, but I can never do it because I am so limited. I'm caught up, I'm busy, and so on. Perhaps another problem is a lack of sincerity. That we wonder sometimes if we really come at our relationships with honesty or not. And maybe we just wear masks with other people and people don't really know who we are. And then we begin to wonder if we know who we are in all of that. And finally, there is the most painful one of all, and that is the death of our loved ones. The separation of the people from the people who've meant the most to us, who have touched us and formed us and have loved us in return. And the great pain that sort of summarizes so much of that, produces much of the loneliness, much of the sense of separation, very often produces that sense of failure around that relationship. So, in reaction to all of that, we'd have to ask ourselves, what do we do with the painful side of relationships? One way is to sort of escape from it all. Escape from it into a world of things. Now, things are more solid than that. Things don't maybe disappoint us so much. You count on those things that are around us, or whatever it is. The toys that we use in leisure time activity, or household goods, or a car, or a boat, or whatever it might be. It seems possible to escape from relationships into the world of things, precisely because it is somehow less painful. The other possibility is that we let the pain of relationships open us up in some way, that we take it on, that we lean into it, to use the image that I've used before, that we allow it to affect us, that we allow it to tutor us, teach us, to help us to get in touch finally with our God. Well, one of the key questions in all of this is, are we able to let the pain of life, the pain of relationships, all of those things I've been describing, to somehow raise the question of God, or to sharpen our thirst for God, to give us a greater appreciation of what the divine is all about. Now, the other thing that we should look at in the terms of relationships are their joy, the exhilaration that they bring us. Well, we should see that very often that is what is the grist of life. That's what we treasure, that's what we count on. We think of family relationships that way, how in times of trouble we turn to them, we expect those people to be there for us. I was just talking to a man recently who lost his wife and was describing to me all of the good people who came forward during this time. A marvelous kind of experience for him. He learned so much, touched him so deeply. He just said he's so grateful to those people, that all the time his wife was suffering, people came over, they cooked meals for him, they'd listen to him, colleagues took classes for him. They set up regular schedule to come and visit his wife, to take her to the hospital. And as people were so understanding to him, and he just found now in retrospect, I mean, a deep, abiding, I hesitate to use the word joy, but some sort of positive feeling, satisfaction or gratitude for all of those good relationships. So in the times of crisis one might especially sense that, but also in all of the ordinary times of life. Just the joy of good conversation, of having the right bridge partner, or playing golf with somebody, or just being able to be present to another person who's important. Those things bring us some of our deep joys in life. As we look further at that, I suppose one of the things that we would have to watch for that is getting compulsive about that. That is so enticing, so good, so liberating in many ways that one can get sort of grasping about that. I want more of that. I got to have it. I got to make it happen. I got to force this other person to be that kind of partner for me. And one can get compulsive about relationships precisely because one feels their positive value, because one is passionate about it, because one has a deep longing for those kinds of joy. It can become, in other words, like everything else in life, like every other created reality, an idol. That is, something that is of preliminary concern can become ultimate concern. That which is finite can become infinite. And then we get that strange behavior of pushing and tugging at relationships and trying to manipulate and control other people, so that we really create a sort of an ideal image that we would like them to be, rather than allowing them to be whatever it is that they really are. Thus, what we do in that way, or any of the times we fall short in our relationships, is fail to refer them to God. Well, then they don't open up. Then they don't reveal the divinity to us. Then they're closed in, and eventually, when some relationship is closed in, it gets stifling. It gets heavy. And so the question we have to ask ourselves, especially in the light of the beauty and the joy and the power of good relationships, is, do they open up? Or in this imagery, do they open up this way into a depth that we would associate with the great mystery, the one that we call God? Well, with that is my way of trying to set the question, to ask to get a slant on how we would look at our relationship. So I'd invite you now to spend a minute or two in a conversation with somebody nearby, and just trying to respond a little bit to this question of personal relationships. You can do it very objectively and talk about the general problems in the culture this way, or you can talk about it more personally and about one's own joys or disappointments in relationships. We'll take just a couple minutes to do this now. Well, I want to talk now about some of Merton's relationships and comment on them. And try to, then after that, I'm going to try to draw out of his writings some insights that he has to offer us on how to improve our personal relationships. We'll begin with his mother, who was a native of our state, of Ohio. The picture I have is that when Merton Thomas was first born, that his mother showed tremendous interest in him. In fact, she used to catalog about everything that he did, write down notes about all of his activities as a little baby. So very close to him in that way. But then when he, at the age of 3, his younger brother, John Paul, was born, and at that point his mother's attention just totally turned 180 degrees to John Paul and really left young Tom almost totally alone. Really treated him in quite a distant fashion after the birth of the second son. And then it was when Thomas was 6 that his mother got sick, terminally ill, and she chose to isolate herself totally from him at that time. She wouldn't let him see her in that state of being ill. She communicated with him by notes. In fact, it was by a note at the age of 6 that he found out that his mother was dying. And then when his mother did that, after she died, she was cremated, and then there was no way in which he was brought in or made part of that ceremony or the ritual surrounding the death, and he was waiting outside when it was raining. So, I mean, that's the rough outline of what happened in relationship to his mother. Now, to do a little analysis of that, it seems as though that set up in him sort of a lifelong search for the feminine, for the woman, for the mother in his life. He used to have a recurring dream. It was about a young Jewish girl, who would embrace him and show him the kind of tenderness and intimacy that he never received from his mother. He called that young girl Proverb, probably thinking of the feminine figure, wisdom, in the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, it would seem as though that all of his life he sort of sought wisdom, and wisdom from women. He became very interested in the great women saints, for example. Julian of Norwich became a very important person long before she's been rediscovered by many of the feminists today. He wrote Dorothy Day often. Many of his correspondents were women. He had a great interest in Teresa of Avila. So the great women saints seemed to fascinate him. And it was always that sort of notion of wisdom, that they knew something that he didn't know. They understood something about life. They represented some whole other aspect of life that he was searching for. He often spoke about his own incompleteness in this way, and looking for whatever it was that would complete his life and his existence. Well, that's some facts with some analysis, I guess, about his relationship with his mother. Then, with his father. His father was an artist type, New Zealander, a traveler, that never put roots down too much. You get the impression of rather a free-spirited fellow. Thomas, loved his father. He wanted to be close to him, especially after his mother's death. But his father really couldn't handle that responsibility. He put him in with his grandparents for a while, and they were sort of an important factor in his life. And his father Tom was living on Long Island. His father went back to Europe. And then periodically his father would call for him and say, well, we're going to get this set up. We'll set up a household and everything, and you'll be able to come and live with me, and it'll be fine. But it would always break down in some way. It never would. It'd work for a period of time, and then his father would be off someplace else again, and Thomas would be sort of left on his own or sent off to boarding school or something like that. So at the age of 10, he did go and join his father in France, and periodically he'd be with him. He always looked forward to that. His father was obviously an important figure in his life. And then at the age of 16, again while he was alone, and you'll see so often in his life Merton was alone when he was faced with difficulties and so on. So when he's alone in a big house, he gets a telegram from his father which is rather incoherent and suggests to him that his father is seriously ill, which as a matter of fact he was, and died not long after that. That set up a lot of things in Merton's psyche. Well, a great longing for his father. He missed him so much. He often had a sense of homelessness throughout his life. A lot of his literature, his poems, always searching for home. Someplace where one would put roots down and be comfortable and in familiar kind of territory. One of the most striking experiences of his life occurred after his father's death, when his father appeared to him one night when he was sleeping and woke up and in his bedroom. And his father was there, sort of a benign peasant. It was a very shaping influence on Merton in his life. So, again, you begin to see a pattern here of the relationships that are often disappointing to him. You begin to see some of the things I was talking about, how Merton would experience the problems of loneliness, of frustration, of people failing you, leaving you, and the death of loved ones. All those painful sides of things I was talking about, Merton really felt in great depth and often with great pain. I think you have to remember, as we talk about Merton, we're dealing with a tremendously sensitive soul. A man attuned to life, passionate about life, and one who would hurt tremendously over all of these things. Perhaps a man, too, as we'll see, who felt the need to escape from much of that pain. One could think of what happened in his life after his father's death as sort of getting away from that. It wasn't too long after that he ended up at Cambridge as a student, and it was there that he got involved in the relationship and was the father of an illegitimate child and so on, and where he sort of ended up abandoning that woman and child. One gets sort of a picture of a man deeply wounded and hurt by his parental experiences and not maybe coping with life all that well as a result. Now I want to talk a little bit about his relationship with his brother, John Paul, 3 years younger than Thomas. Take the story, I guess, much in the way he does it, and that is picking it up after Thomas went to the monastery in the early 40s. His brother ended up in the service, and before he was going to go into active combat, and I believe my remembrance is that he was in the Air Force, he came to visit Tom at Gethsemane, at the monastery. And he came there not only to see his brother, but in order to become a Catholic. You got to remember, Merton was a convert, didn't grow up in a Catholic family. In fact, it was a pretty religious family. And I don't know exactly why, but his brother became interested in Catholicism, and he came to the monastery to visit his brother and to get instructions from him and to see how he could join up in the church. And so this was so important to Merton, and he began to see that his brother knew almost nothing about Catholicism, and he started him on a crash course. He was telling him everything he could. He got permission from the abbot to spend all kind of hours with him. He's teaching him everything and all these scholastic doctrines and all the sacramentals and the prayers and all of the things that we knew from the pre-Vatican II church. And he was, really into all of this. And he would finally, he says, after, a couple days or 3 days, he was just exhausted and said he didn't have anything more to say, and his brother would still wanted to hear more. He couldn't get enough of it. So after all of that, it was decided that his brother would make his first communion. I think in sort of a private mass that Abbott or somebody was having there, that his brother would be received into the church at this time. Now I want to read you a little bit of what happens at this point. So he's gone through all of this, and the big day comes now. And says the next morning, all through chapter, the obscure worry that John Paul would get lost and not be able to find his way down to the chapel of Our Lady of Victories had been haunting me. Isn't that interesting? I mean, he's going through all this. It's time to have the Mass. He's worried that his brother won't get there, won't find it. As soon as chapter was over, I hurried to the church ahead of Reverend Father and entered the big empty building and knelt down. John Paul was nowhere in sight. I turned around. At the end of the long nave, with its empty choir stalls on each side, high up in the empty tribune, John Paul was kneeling, all alone, in uniform. He seemed to be an immense distance away. In the choir where I was a locked door, and I couldn't call out to him how to come down the long way around through the guest house, and he didn't understand my sign. At that moment there flashed into my mind all the scores of time in our forgotten childhood when I had chased John Paul away with stones from the place where my friends and I were building a hut. And now all of a sudden, here it was all over again. A situation that was externally of the same pattern. John Paul standing, confused and unhappy, at a distance which he was not able to bridge. Sometimes the same image haunts me now, that he is dead, as though he were standing helpless in purgatory, depending more or less on me to get him out of there, waiting for my prayers. But I hope he is out of it by now. Father Master went off to get him, and I started lighting the candles on the altar of Our Lady of Victories, and by the time the Mass started, I could see out of the corner of my eye that he was kneeling there at one of the benches. And so we received communion together, and the work was done. So as was indicated here, his brother went off, and he was flying a mission over the North Sea, and they were hit and fell into the sea, and he was rescued for a while and kept in a raft but he was severely injured. He was kept calling out for water. He was thirsty all the time, and after a few days like that died and was buried at sea. It hurt Merton very much. He wrote a poem about it. I don't really know that I want to read all of this. I don't know. A sample of his poetry. Sweet brother, if I do not sleep, my eyes are flowers for your tomb. And if I cannot eat my bread, my fast shall live like willows where you die. If in the heat I find no water for my thirst shall turn to springs for you, poor traveler. Where in what desolate and smoky country lies your poor body lost and dead? And in what landscape of disaster has your unhappy spirit lost its road? Come, in my labor find a resting place, and in my sorrows lay your head. Or rather take my life and blood and buy yourself a better bed. Or take my breath and take my death and buy yourself a better rest. When all the men of war are shot and flags have fallen into dust, your cross and mine shall tell men still Christ died on each for both of us. For in the wreckage of your April, Christ lies slain, and Christ weeps in the ruins of my spring. The money of whose tears shall fall into your weak and friendless hand and buy you back to your own land. Silence of whose tears shall fall like bells upon your alien tomb. Hear them and come. They shall call you home. Well, that is the complete poem that I read to you. There's things about that, I think, that are revealing about Merton. small things bothered him. I mean, he would be the kind, I guess, in the modern terminology, we would say, would often beat himself for his transgressions. He often felt badly about his relationships and his performance. You know, to imagine all those years later, he's haunted by the fact he didn't let his brothers play with him and build a hut with him, kept him away. I suppose most people dismiss that kind of thing and hardly ever return to those kinds of things. And Merton's sensitive soul was hurt by that. Would bring it back, felt terrible about the way he had treated his brother. It brings out, I think, that sort of sensitivity that he had. Interesting in his writings, he so often returns to the Cain and Abel myth. And he clearly identifies himself with Cain. He's the one who killed Abel, the one who let down his brother, the one who wasn't as faithful as he ought to be. What's interesting, I mean, in the poem Geography of Logrère, which is his most famous poem, that is the dominant myth, the dominant metaphor, the Cain and Abel story. He identified with Cain. He saw himself as guilty very often in relationships. You see some interesting exceptions to that, perhaps, but very often I think that was his dominant kind of mood. I think it is no doubt that his brother was very important to him. Again, it represented that painful side of it. And his brother's death haunted him. You can see the interesting church imagery, the classical Catholicism. Even they thought of his brothers in purgatory, waiting for him to say the prayers, or say the masses, or do the good intentions to get his brother out of purgatory. And that maybe he had failed him again in not doing that. You see a very traditional kind of Catholicism there in Merton. Let me take up another one. And this is the one that we had in the handout. I'd really rather that you didn't look at it at the moment, but just to remind you of this is when Merton went to the monastery. I think much of it involved sort of an escape from relationships. Not saying he went there to escape. That would be far too simple. I don't really want to say that. But in his writing and everything, the feeling you get is that, it's almost better to be apart from those relationships. All those relationships in the world will pull you down or mess you up. They will somehow be a problem area for you. He was going to get on to the major relationship of working on that one with God. That would be sort of his primary intent. Well, let's get it straight with God. We're into prayer now. We're into solitude. And I don't think that he had a very good feeling about the positive side of relationships. Well, it's not too surprising given his long history here of relationships. Although to complete this picture, I must say, while he was at Columbia University, he met very good friends. He had Bob Lax and a lot of the people who remained his friends throughout his whole life. So that should be factored in. He wasn't a loner in that sense. He was very popular in college. A lot of good friends. They partied a lot. They had good times together. They were very close. So let's keep that into the picture. And there's a way in which he kept those relationships in the monastery. But the big thing was to concentrate on God. There was not much of a sense that people would be a vehicle to get you closer to God. Very little sense of that. Then one day, he left the monastery, went into Louisville, and my memory is not serving me well here, maybe to go into the hospital to a visit doctor's checkup or something. And that's where we get this interesting experience. And I'm just going to read it. You already read it, but I want to just bring it out again. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine, and I's heirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. And a telling phrase, it was like waking from a dream of separateness. of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. You get the picture there. So that's all referring to the life in the monastery as a life where he went in sort of a dream and lived in an illusory kind of world of renunciation where you gave everything up, lived apart from people and from the ordinary cares of the world. A life of supposed holiness. A life in which maybe that's how one thought one was going to get holy or close to God by staying away from relationships. And suddenly, in a blinding insight, and much of Merton's life revolves around these great moments, the eureka moments, the mystical experiences, the deep religious moments. And here we have one of the great ones of his life. He just sees it. I mean, he doesn't figure it out. He doesn't sit there and say, these people are important, they reveal God because Paul Rahner wrote an article about it. It's not like that. Merton is very intuitive. Merton responds to life. Things sort of come to him in a flash, and then he sort of works them out from there on. So in this flash, in this great eureka moment, great, I think, religious experience in Merton's life, suddenly it's all different, and he sees his connectedness, his closeness, all the separate business that had dominated his feeling and his thinking, he thinks, isn't right. There are bonds that unite us closer together. They were mine and I theirs. He loved these people. Didn't necessarily have to just get away from them all the time. He loved them. Like waking from a dream of separateness. Well, I think that is an extremely important experience, too, in Merton's life. It sort of sets now a whole new tone. I mean, his writing takes on a different character after this. Now people can be catalysts for his relationship with God. Now they can bring him closer instead of bringing away. Now they can bring a deep joy and not just the kind of pain that he had so often associated with these relationships. And then finally, the last one of the relationships that I want to talk about, and that is with the student nurse, who in Michael Mott's book is simply referred to as F, in order to protect her identity, although it is well known to many people. So one time in 1966, when Merton was in the hospital, a student nurse came in to see him and said that she was in charge of taking care of him and so on, and his original impressions were that she talked too much and was going to be sort of a drag to have to relate to her, I guess. And as time went on, he found himself more interested in her, and by the time he left the hospital, he wanted to carry on the relationship and tried to set it up that way so that they could continue to communicate. He instructed her to send letters to him in terms of writing, what did they do in the monastery, write confidential on it or personal matter or something, I forget how they did that, but so that his mail was all censored. And so the only mail they didn't read is if it was put down that it was a conscience matter or something like that. And so he instructed this young student nurse to do that. Student nurse, I guess, had remarkable characteristics like Faber did, the young woman of his dreams. Remarkable similarities to her. And he obviously was fascinated with this young woman. They began to relate more closely. There were times in which his behavior, I guess, we would commonly call adolescent. He told a lot of his friends about the relationship. There's the kid that when they would come to the monastery and take him out, they always had to have money in their pockets so he could stop at a payphone and call her. There was a lot of his friends looked down on the relationship, didn't like it at all. They tried to talk him out of it. They put her down, talked badly about her. He even went so far as to have her come to the monastery and visit there. As time went on, it's clear they fell deeply in love. And he says that openly. He wrote her many love poems and letters. He speaks very passionately about the relationship. He saw her as the real ideal reader. The ideal reader. That is, he felt that she understood him as no one else did. All of his life he wanted to be understood. He always wrote these volumes so that people would understand, and he was always disappointed. No one understood him, or there was always this gap. But she understood perfectly. She understood everything he had to say. Even if he would go into a long discourse and she wouldn't respond, say anything, he took that to mean, aha, she really does know what I am talking about. And so that was part, clearly, of the fascination in the whole of the relationship. He has passages in his journals where they wrestle with the question of, is he going to leave the monastery? Are they going to get married? What are they going to do about this relationship? He found his solitude disturbed in many ways. And as time went on, he made, it seems to me, a rather clear decision that no, his vocation was to be a monk, and that is the direction that he would go. Now, at one point, and I'm going to talk much more about this next week, or build on it, and I don't want to analyze it, but Merton would often call her on the phone from the monastery, where any of the monks could hear it. And as a matter of fact, finally, one of the monks did hear the conversation, reported him to the abbot, Abbot Fox, and of course Abbot Fox called him in and forbade him to see the student nurse from then on. Well, as we'll see, that's rather strange, isn't it? It's obvious, not obvious, but one could easily surmise that he wanted to get caught. And he wanted Abbot Fox to tell him to break off the relationship. And eventually, one could say that he did. There were long periods of time when he didn't call her or see her. The last time was in the summer of '68. He died in the fall of, when was it, December of '68. And in the summer was the last time that he talked to her. Well, without going into more of the details of the whole relationship here, it speaks a lot about Merton's own drive for the feminine. It picks up a lot of the other themes, the relationship to Proverbs of his dreams. It points very often to a great deal of insensitivity on his part, I think, towards this woman. It often found it hard to understand it from her side, or the kind of difficulty she had in the relationship. There's no doubt that the whole experience transformed him, changed his thinking about many things. His poetry and his writing changed after that time. I think I indicated last time that it became more sensual, it became more touching. The word touching was used more. He saw relationships, I think, in a more positive kind of way. One way of saying it was that he no longer feared as much as he did before the ardent or passionate side of himself. In some ways he came to terms with that, didn't feel the need perhaps to keep it in such sharp check as he once did. I think to repeat, there is this little doubt that the experience is a great shaping one in his life, that it transformed him in many ways, that he saw life and his relationship to God in different ways after this particular encounter. Maybe in our discussion, questions or comments will bring up other sides of that, but I think we'll sort of leave it there for now. So those are some of the major relationships in his life, and of course there were many others. As you know, he corresponded with 1,500 people, had many close friends. At his funeral, it was interesting that so many of the people who came there thought that they were sort of his closest friends. that was rather common denominator. Here's a phrase that's not going to come to me exactly, but I have become a stranger in order that I can be a friend of all. There's a phrase that I'm missing, but in other words, from his viewpoint, he became a stranger to almost everybody but the student nurse, so that he could be friend to all. In other words, he was an extremely complex person. You can see that each one of these friends saw him in a particular way, knew a particular aspect of him. But as you start to piece the pieces of the puzzle together, very few of these people understood what Merton as a whole was all about. And that quote makes me think as though it's almost by design. It's almost by design that he had these many people he related to. And when you read the letters, you can see this. He will just pick up one theme that goes through the letter with a particular person. It's very personal in a way, but it leaves out everything else that he's thinking or is about and relates to that area. And very often it's to do with the area that other person is strongest in or most interested in. About Merton up to this point. Still looking for that other quote. Comment, direction. Was there? Yes, but I think it began to change before. I don't think that she was the total catalyst for that. I think it was the experience in Louisville that happened before that, which made it, began to set him in a different direction this way. Again, you have to place Merton in context. I mean, we're dealing with a previous age. All this personalism that we know today in the Catholic Church has been sort of a post-Vatican II phenomenon. Some people in the room are able to think back, and I don't think there were a lot of sermons or teachings about people as catalysts for bringing us closer to God. I mean, there was a way in which marriage was talked about in that way, but there was a different feel for that. You got close to God by this way. It was a very vertical kind of spirituality. So Merton's not atypical. I mean, he is typical of the age and the time. Because the whole theology of grace then was very different. As we often say, it was a superstructure, so that grace was on top of nature. Sort of this natural world of relating to people, and then there was the grace world on top of it. That's the popular image of how that worked itself out. And those two worlds didn't have a lot to do with one another very often. So you got holy by going to church, and you would meet God in the sacraments and so on. The idea of meeting God in the world was not often thought of in that way. In fact, it was commonly thought that monks would be holier people than married people, for example, or that priests and nuns would somehow automatically be holier than other people. That it was a holier, that was really common. It was a holier vocation to leave the world somehow. In fact, you get the imitation of Christ talking negatively about it. Every time then you go out into the world, you become less human and less of a person and less of a Christian. So we have to remember that in looking at Merton. Remember, he died in 68, and a lot of his writing comes before that period. It's really quite a different scene. But he was a person of his age in that way. And he learned a theology that was very classical, very traditional, and that I think rather hurt him as he went along. Now, when he became a Catholic in the 40s, as a matter of fact, there was a lot of good theology available, a different kind of theology that saw it very differently, but he wasn't aware of that. He did not know about that other sort of line of thought that sees God present in the world, sees that all of reality can bring us closer to God, that sees our jobs and work in the world as being part of our working out of our holiness, that sees marriage as a legitimate vehicle of holiness, so on. All of that it was available, but Merton didn't learn it. He learned something else. Yeah.
So he came out of a classic theology, and he had that ability to say that he had these letters going with Muslim scholars and
right. That is the interesting thing. I mean, Merton is like a man that's got on two wavelengths. The comment was made, yet he had all these letters going with the Muslims and the Hindus and all the interest in the East and openness and so on. And I said this, I think, last time, that one of the Muslims wanted one of his early books, and he wouldn't send it to him because he's embarrassed in there, because he called Islam a pagan religion. And therefore he was then embarrassed to do it. So the clear thing about Merton is that he grew as he went along. He developed, and he sort of developed his own theology in a way, that and followed his gut instinct more often. But he was a man who learned a theology that just said that kind of thing, that Hinduism was a pagan religion and nothing about it except bad. And he never knew what to do with that, because even before he became a Catholic, he met this interesting Hindu fellow who he liked, and seemed to have a good sense of the divine or the mystery. And that confused him. I mean, he was a man whose theology didn't fit with what was going on inside of himself. Now, in that way, he's very typical of so many people walking around yet today. You know, I run into people all the time like that. They're working with the pre-Vatican II theology, but their guts or their intuitions tell them that it can't be that narrow or that exclusive, you know, or that life's got to be more integrated than that. And very often it's very liberating for them when they find out that there is a strain of thought within the Christian world today, and Catholicism in particular, that might fit for them. You know, I mean, so someone's into psychology and self-development and self-actualization, and they like Rogers and Allport and Maslow, and they want to get their head together and get over their guilt trip and all of this. And some of the people who are going about doing that think that they have to leave the church to do that, because their theology is one they remember of saying, you're a bad person and you better be obedient, and you better toe the line, and you're not supposed to think for yourself or interpret. You're supposed to just be obedient and do what the church says and so on, and that God is sort of an ogre that will punish them, and Christ is a divine figure who they just sort of don't know how to get in touch with, and therefore they're split. They don't know where to go. But if they read some theology, modern theology, or read about certain lines of thought within the church today that says, well, God wants us to develop our talents. God wants us to actualize our gifts. You know, and that God's the one who calls upon us to co-create the world with Him. And Christ is the perfect human being, the most actualized man who ever lived. And the church is a place where we're all supposed to get together and use our talents and gifts. And then they say, oh, is that what it is? Is that what it's all about? Well, I can come back to that. I can get into that. That fits now. Now I'm in sync with what's in my gut. And so Merton's problem is a problem that is just multiplied over and over. And you know, as many times as you run around giving that kind of lecture, the next day you meet somebody else who's never heard of such a thing, who thinks that the Catholic Church is as repressive as they remember it when the nun threw him up against the blackboard in the third grade. I begin to wonder if those stories are really true, you know. But yeah, I mean, we got all kind of people running around like that, and their theology is out of sync with what's in their gut. And that's a lot of the way I see Merton. Now, Merton was big enough and bright enough to sort of go with his intuition. And he was able to read widely, very widely in religious literature. Not so much, he read one book of Rahner's, for example. So he didn't read widely in contemporary theology, but he'd read Hinduism and Islam and the cargo cults and the islands, and all kinds of, sort of strange things. Or he'd read Julian of Norwich or the women mystics and so on. And that opened up a new world for him. So I think you're right. He was on two wavelengths. That was part of his problem. That's part of his conflict in life. And he's just like a lot of people, other people today, trying to find a theology that fits, trying to find a way of understanding Christianity that accords, is in sync with what's in one's gut and one's heart.
Did the Second Vatican Council affect him at all, or was he?
The question is asked by the Second Vatican Council, and he was extremely affected by the whole discussion, and his primary interest was in the pastoral constitution, the so-called Schema 13, or the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, and in that his big concern was the nuclear question. So he lobbied for that. He wrote letters to Rome. He was passionate about that. He wanted that strong statement against nuclear weaponry. And he was so afraid that they were going to sell out, and that they were going to, his great fear was the people who he thought were starting to think in terms like this, that, well, the Russians have this threat, and they could get us at any moment. So maybe, just maybe, what we have to do is get them first. And that might be okay theologically. There were people talking like that. That maybe to save ourselves from that threat, we could strike first. It was one of those surgical strikes. And that's what he feared. I can see that in his letters. That comes up over and over. That's what he didn't want to happen. And he wanted a strong statement by the Second Vatican Council that would say, no to nuclear warfare, especially any preemptive first strike like that. So I would say that's the thing about the council that probably he was most passionate about, cared most about. Well, let me go on here and say some things that I think we could glean from his writings. I think you're going to find that some of these things overlap. I don't know how else to do it, but let's see what we can make of it. I got about 7 ideas we might get from him. One, the importance of truthfulness and sincerity in relationships. So he wrote a lot about the great dangers of wearing masks in relating to people, of coming at people with our false self, of using pretenses, of just flattering people, saying, as he said, the pleasant things always that wouldn't disturb people and would mildly amuse them, sort of staying always on a superficial level so no one would ever be upset or get hurt by anything that would end up being said. So he saw the root problem here as one of fear that we were not loved or acceptable. And so that because a person would feel unloved or unacceptable, then they would try to pretend to be something they weren't so as to sort of impress the other people in the relationship. So that one would never get around to real candidness or frankness, but one would always be dealing from a certain insincerity or lack of truthfulness in the relationship. In fact, he saw that as the source of many of our problems in life. And that was one of his primary things, the sense of our own unworthiness. Now, you can see that in himself. I mean, I think that was part of his root problem. That he had trouble loving himself, that he had trouble accepting his own self as it was. And so I think he spoke this out of a real deep sense of things, out of his own experience. So he saw that as a root problem. So then he thought we live in a culture that reinforces that, says always tell people what they want to hear. It seems to me I see a little bit of that in his letters. at times, sort of telling people what they might want to hear. Then, as he tries to say, well, what are we supposed to do about that? How are we supposed to get over that? His root response to it is that we have to believe that indeed God loves us just as we are. And in saying that, he is part of, a whole long tradition. Well, Tillich talks about in terms we must learn to accept that we are accepted despite the fact that we feel unacceptable. Or as Ronner would say, we have to learn to believe and to drink in the fact that we are loved even though we might feel unlovable. So Merton, I think, stands with many other people as thinking that that's one of the most important things in life, one of the keys to living well. Then maybe one would be able to interact with others in a prudent way. He's not in favor of total candidness or frankness or just saying everything to everybody or unburdening one's soul to a casual acquaintance. He's really opposed to that. He thinks there's a prudence in the way we reveal ourselves, that has to be gradual and done in accord with the other person's ability to treasure that and to accept whatever it is that we have to reveal. He says we need a deep courage to be direct and simple with other people. He wanted directness, and getting down to the simple truth of things. Get away from all of the verbiage and so on that clouds whatever is going on. Finally, he thought that sincerity was really a matter of love. That it's when we love ourselves that we would be able to then relate to others in a really loving way and to be truthful with them. Well, what do you make of that analysis? I think his fundamental point is one that we need to keep repeating over and over. The fundamental message of Christianity, that we are loved by God, even in the midst of our weaknesses, our sins. God still loves us. That's absolutely crucial. I think his call to, he doesn't like superficiality, I guess. He likes, sometimes, I guess from Merton's viewpoint, you need a soul to soul. You need just to say it like it is and to know the other person accepts it. It's something like that I would get out of him. There's a truthfulness. In other words, truthfulness doesn't mean that you don't tell the other person lies, first of all. It's got something else to do with the quality of the relationship, with the directness of it, the unmasking, and the willingness to be close to one another. Second thing that we might get out of it is the great importance for a self-sacrificing love. And one of the first things he would think we need to sacrifice is our need for reassurance. The need to be comforted by the other person. Even the need always to be understood. He thinks that's one of the things we would have to let go of in relationships. Sacrifice that. He says that we need to learn to love even if the other person does not return it or doesn't console us in response. I'm reminded of Maslow's thing here where he talks about one of the marks of maturity is that one doesn't need so many strokes. He says that one of the marks of maturity is that one doesn't have to hear just repeatedly over and over from one's beloved that I love you. One sort of gets to know that and understands it and accepts it and knows it's there and doesn't need to just have it repeated or shown over and over. In other words, one has enough self-confidence and is sacrificed in a way that need for strokes, to use the common parlance today, to give up on that in a way. He says this, that acts of disinterested love cleanse the whole person. In other words, to really do something where there's not a return, where someone doesn't necessarily say thank you, where you do it just because it's right or because you love the person. He sees that as a catharsis, as cleansing us, as purifying us. He says, we're able to do that, then we'll feel light. We'll feel like we're traveling down the path in a lighter way. We'll feel free, he says. He even thinks that will help us physically. That act of disinterested love will help us to be less tired, less fatigued. He even thinks it would help us to get over some illnesses. Interesting thing, that would enable us to maybe get over emotional problems, mental illnesses, and even physical illnesses. Acts of disinterested love. That is simply to reach out. Well, we know this is true. I mean, this is no great revelation. And one of the great antidotes to depression is to get up and do something for somebody else. Because what it does, of course, in a simple way, is get our minds off of ourselves. And has a strange way of lifting us out, of giving us freedom of this. He says, giving us new energy. He says that true happiness really comes only in getting away from ourselves and our own limited sphere of interests and needs. He feared a narrow world. He feared getting imprisoned, of getting in a rut, thinking the same way over and over. I know people like that who articulate that very well. They're in midlife and they just fear the rut. They fear that it's just going to always be like this, that life's going to get to be a rat race. It's just going to go around and around. There won't be anything new, anything exciting, anything to get the juices flowing anymore. It'll just be like this. And Merton's antidote is to get into a disinterested love, agape, as we said, a kind of self-sacrificing love that tries to focus just on the other person and what we might do for them, to rejoice in the good of others. He's big on that. He doesn't want us to get into a position where when others accomplish or do well that it feels like it diminishes us. He says what we've got to learn to do is to celebrate those good things. Rejoice when other people accomplish. Feel good about it because they're doing well, and don't feel put down, or I'm less because they're more. He thinks that's a wrong kind of set of relationships. Then he says that when we're able to do that and get into this disinterested love, then he said God will be present, or in his phrase, to quote, God will be brought about on earth. It's almost like his sense is that in that act of love, God will be born or incarnated. God will be present right there. And that reminds me of much of what Ronner said. His famous phrase of, he says, well, did you ever think of a time when you did something for somebody and you knew they wouldn't appreciate it, you knew they wouldn't say thank you, and you knew you wouldn't even feel good about doing it? And he said, if you've ever done that, then you can be sure that time and eternity met. Then you can be sure that the Spirit was at work. Don't even feel good about doing it. And that's got the same ring of what Merton is talking about here, self-sacrificing love. Well, what are we to say about this? Well, I suppose the first thing one would say is that sounds unrealistic. You know, do people really act in that way? You know, do people really move beyond like that? Well, is that really possible? Isn't there always a bit of selfishness, of self-interest in our loving? I don't know. It's an interesting question, isn't it? I don't think, for one thing, we can ever get at the bottom of our motivation. I think you could spend all day trying to get self-sacrificing or disinterested, and at the end of it, you wouldn't be sure if you did it or not. Well, I got some doubts about that. I'm not so sure that any act is ever that pure, that idealistic. But on the other hand, it seems to me that there's great advice in that to sort of move us in a direction and say, couldn't there be more times when I reduce the ego, reduce the self-interest in my relationship, at least get it more manageable control? Maybe some people, when they hear that, see it as a more attainable ideal. I see it as a corrective to an egocentrism, to a selfishness, and a sense of putting ourselves always in center, that it would help correct all of that. Third, he suggests that we overcome the preoccupation with being worthy. I remember just flashing this at a party one time, very together guy I respected a lot, good marriage relationship, very successful man. And in conversation, he said, you know, it remains constantly mysterious to me why, named his wife, she loves me. You know, he said, it in a way makes me feel so unworthy. Now, a lot of people, if you'd hear him say that, you'd say, well, yeah, I can understand that. Say, well, you are hard to live with. You are a bear, or you know, I don't know why she stays with you either. No, but in this case, it was so shockingly different. I mean, you know, I happen to know them quite well, and so on, and so it made quite a profound effect on me, and I began to test that notion of people feeling unworthy in relationships. And I believe it is far more widespread than perhaps I at one time thought. I think it's a rather common feeling when one is loved deeply and intensely, sort of in an unconditional way, that it produces that sort of sense of unworthiness. Well, Merton thinks that as a culture, and especially in the church, we're hung up on being worthy. He thinks it's the wrong question, in a way. It's the wrong category to use. And he attacks it in this way by saying, if you start out with that, you know, getting worthy in relationship with God, the only thing you'd end up saying is you could never be worthy. God's love is so great, so merciful, so all-forgiving, so unconditional, that no matter how perfect you were and how great, how saintly, you could never be worthy of it. And therefore, get off that kick, in the sense of trying to be worthy. Quit trying to be worthy of God's love, because you can't do it anyway. And in a sense, he's saying, quit trying to be worthy of other people's love, in a way. But the root thing is to try to quit having a sense of being worthy of God's love. He says that the discovery that worthiness is the wrong question is one of the great liberating moments in life. It's sort of that game ended. Now, we in the Catholic circles know that as sort of the merit game. You know, where one is going to pile up merit, do so many good things, and then go to God and say, I got my right to heaven. You know, I have really done the job here and have given up a lot of things and toed the line straight and narrow. Now, sort of, I deserve my reward. Well, back in the 16th century, our Protestant friends, really rebelled against that. They went in a totally other direction. He said, there's no work, no merit. No, it's totally free gift of God. Well, I think that, I don't think that they had it totally right either, and I think they would see that now. But that line of thought remains a good corrective, I think, especially to us Catholics. It is not a question of worthiness, of piling up merits, and Merton's fundamental reason is because you couldn't pile up enough anyway. Couldn't get enough merits that would say you get into heaven or could deserve this great reward. Couldn't do it anyway, so give it up and start to relate in another way. And that new way of relating, of course, is to sense God's love, to know that the love overcomes all of our sins and all of our faults and failings, and always is calling us to become our better selves. And that love then frees us to do good things. Well, I think that's where the Protestants had it one-sided. They didn't have enough sense of how that should issue into good work, issue in a life in which the Christian virtues are evident. Anyway, Merton's big thing is, let's get rid of trying to be worthy in our relation with God, and I think, corollary, in our relationship with other people. Now, again, I can certainly see situations where that would sound to me to be awfully good advice. I can think of marital situations where one spouse just bends over backwards, kills himself to try to get the other one to love them or to respond. They just lose their identity, they lose their personhood, in many cases they lose their dignity in doing that. And that's not all that uncommon either. And I suppose if you were to break it down culturally, it's much more of the problem for women in relationships than for men. Although I might have to nuance that a bit. But this business of, always giving up oneself or putting aside one's own project or one's own thoughts in order to please or to keep peace or to keep the other one from, just getting all upset and angry, that is part of the problem. And it seems to me Merton's sense of, if you took this seriously, get rid of the question of worthiness, then you wouldn't do that. Wouldn't be just overboard and trying to win the other person's approval. Someday you would end up just saying, hey, here I am, this is me. Are we going to make it or not? Can we relate or not? This is it. So I think that's important for the young people going together, to get off tiptoes and to quit putting the best foot forward and to just appear as oneself. I remember telling that to a young woman one time and in a relationship, and the relationship lasted for about 3 weeks after that. It just was really true. He loved an ideal image of her. And when she was herself and got off tiptoes and eggshells, just said, here I am, then he didn't like it. And thank goodness she found out then, and thank goodness he found out then. So, I find some great wisdom in this. Again, it's like much of what Merton says, it feels so one-sided to me. I certainly wouldn't think that one would want to take this and say, well, I'm not going to try to improve. I got a terrible temper, and that's how I am, and take it or leave it. I wouldn't think that was good. I wouldn't think that we would want to hear this and say that I'm not going to try to get over my faults or improve myself or somehow come across to my friends or my intimates or spouses to say, well, it's just it. I don't think we should settle for mediocrity because we're not going to try to be worthy. In a way, I'd like to sometimes think I'd like to be worthy of someone else's love, or at least in a sense I'd like to be responsive or live up to some of the ideals or say I would improve myself in a way so that it would work better. 4, avoid projecting onto the other person. He says this, he says, perhaps we create an image of others out of the material that we don't like about ourselves or would like to eliminate. Now, this is just would be some of our relationships. It's always interesting to see who bugs us a lot. And I think a lot of times, if we look closely, they will have characteristics that we don't particularly like about ourselves. You might check that out for the people who really rub you the wrong way. That it might be that they show signs of stuff we just don't like about ourselves. And so it becomes a matter of projection. And this fits into the same idea of the positive side of projecting an ideal and then loving that. Caring about that person that I would dream about or would like them to be. I suppose today we use the language of stereotyping. Let's not stereotype these other people. I think he says that in another place. Yeah. Let's just stick with the projection idea here. Be alert to when we might end up doing that. Now again, I would think there's something worthwhile seeing about that. I think that invites us to a greater self-honesty. It might get us in touch with some of the things that we don't like about ourselves and never face. Could move us to improve in some ways. Could maybe help us to relate to those other people better who we don't get along with. If we saw that maybe they're just like us and are struggling with the same problems, the same common tendencies, maybe it would make me more empathetic to them and say, yep, that's me, and maybe now we could both work on it or help one another to improve. 5, limit the desire to be loved. He says that most people want to be loved as if they were God, and then feel that it is unjust when people don't treat them this way. It's like saying, well, I'm better than that, or I deserve better than that. Interesting phrase. It's typical Merton hyperbole, I guess. Most people want to be loved as if they were God, to be treated in this way. And he says that what we often presume is that other people are being loved this way. Other people are treasured that way. Or in other marriages, the partners do really respect one another, while in my marriage it doesn't work like that. No, his wife is on a pedestal, why aren't I with my spouse? So he thinks that those things go in tandem, therefore, that we end up presuming that the others are getting what we would like, that is, to be treated with greater respect, or, in his phrase, as though we were God. So he says part of what we would end up trying to do here is be more realistic about what is possible. So that maybe we have to realize people have different LQs or love quotients, various abilities to care and to overcome their selfishness. So we become more realistic about what could be. One of the ways that things I get out of this is a phrase I often use, that people will always end up disappointing us, and we can count on that, and we should expect it, be ready for it. Or put another way, we can always expect that things will go badly in marriages. Always something will go wrong. Always there will be some problem, some lack of communication. And so we start out expecting that, and that the real trick in life is to know what to do when that finally surfaces. When one gets in touch with what that problem area is, then the trick is to have a tool to deal with it, which we commonly call these days dialogue. So, I go back to Gustav Weigel's statement that all things human, given enough time, go badly. That personal relationships are a good example. Sooner or later, we're not going to be attentive to one another, or I'm going to miss the cue you give me, or I'm going to be insensitive, or I'm going to say the wrong thing, or some part of my personality is going to get on your nerves. If we relate long enough, that's what's going to happen. A lot of times people have fun going away to school for 6 weeks. When I say 6 weeks is just about time to be away in a school setting where you get to know each other and it works really nice, but not long enough to really rub up against in an abrasive way. And those are nice times. Or weekends, retreats, or weeks apart at a study session or something. Vacations with another couple. There seems to be a time limit on it, in a way, before we begin to feel that abrasive kind of character. So I believe that, again, I'm saying, well, what would I get out of this bit? Limit your desire to be loved. I think that there is a point about it to sort of temper our expectations. To take people for what they're worth. I often think of the young people working at relationships. It seems so much healthier if they can do that instead of just getting head over heels quickly or getting totally involved right away. That if they could just sort of go along and see what's there, see what develops, stay open to it, reveal oneself gradually, see where it goes. Not always thinking it's got to end up in marriage, it's got to end up in intimacy. This person is, it seems much wiser to, in all relationships, I just taking that as one example, if we can just let them be and allow people to be what they are, and whatever's there, fine. Thank you, Lord. What isn't there, get on with life. I believe there's a proper letting go that I would get out of what he is saying here. 6, unlearn the superficial and habitual ways of experiencing other people. He thinks, of course, that habit and routine are the great enemy of growth in relationships. And what happens, he thinks, over a period of time is we get a grid through which we view people, and we always see them that way. I can read her like a book becomes the favorite phrase. And of course, as soon as I can read her like a book, then she can't surprise me. Well, then she can't get exciting for me in a new way. Then I can't see something new about her. Well, then I have pigeonholed this person, probably blocked off what is neat or beautiful or surprising, or the way she has grown or developed or become a new kind of person. Well, so the habitual ways of experiencing other people, he thinks that's bad. And he thinks that's a problem in the culture as a whole. And he thinks it comes from the world of advertising. He thinks it comes because we got so many stimuli hitting us. We got so many experiences, so many images. So much coming from the media. We're just bombarded. And he says what we do is erect a protective insensibility. We just got to turn off. It's just too much stimuli. We drive ourselves nutty trying to drink it all in. The world's too fast. It's too complex. There's too much going on. You just have to scream. Block it out. So he thinks that's what happens in the culture as a whole. It's one of the things I'm picking up from Merton. One of the deepest things he feels, that what's wrong with our modern world. It's too fast. It's too quick. There's too many images. And therefore, we can't stay with any one of them. And we get superficial and we screen out because we'll go crazy. We'll feel overload. Then that's what he thinks happens with people. So what we do is we fall back into our ordinary way of viewing people, relating to them. All becomes the pattern and the same, and nothing new can happen, and the relationship begins to wither then. So he says we have to unlearn. We have to learn, put positively, we have to learn how to appreciate people in a new way. Now, I like this point, and I think that it has a lot of merit. I mean, how would you do that? Well, I can think of situations like marriage counseling where I would suggest people go to an offbeat movie and discuss it afterwards. Or read a book in a genre type that neither one is into or has read before, and share responses to it. That technique they use in marriage encounter, I've heard people say, write down every day, pick a topic and write down how you feel about it. Many people find that opens up new avenues, or they see their spouse. You mean, you don't like her either? All these years, I never said anything bad about her because I thought she was your best friend. Now I find out you don't like her either. Now we have more in common. In other words, the technique is to open up something new about the other person. I don't know, how do you do that? I think that maybe more than technique, it's a willingness to give the other person a chance to develop. To realize that people change because of their experiences and what they are, learned, and so on, and to sort of expect that, and to want to hear about it. Something new happens. With our friends, I feel that's an important one, and maybe we ought to figure out how to do that better. Finally, in picking up on Merton's commentary on the Good Samaritan parable, in this example is someone maybe who sees it in a fresh way. I think he's good at. So Merton says when he looks at that parable, after the guy's injured by the road and people pass him by and so on, it's a response to the question, if you remember, who is my neighbor then? So Merton says that the premise of the question is to classify, to categorize. That is, the premise of the question is to separate out, well, okay, these are the people who are my neighbor and I'm supposed to be nice to them, and these other people aren't, and I don't have to worry about them. This is typical Merton. What he says is the problem is the question's wrong. The problem is the very attempt to ask the question in that way, to ask for classification. And that what Jesus' answer is supposed to mean is that classifications are useless. It doesn't make any sense to ask questions like that when you're talking about people. Which people are worthy of help and which aren't? He says with love doesn't have anything to do with that. Love is free. Love is given to whoever is in need. Love is given to the whole of the human family. It should not, as he says, be dictated by the outside forces. My love shouldn't be dependent, this is one of his major themes, on what's going on out there, or what other people are doing, or how they're responding, or how much money they got, or however you might want to classify people. Maybe the one of the ones that you could really get at it is classify them according to the ones I like and don't like, or my perceptions of which ones like me and don't like me. Well, that might be a way you sort of tend to break it down. Maybe that's one of the classifications that most people at least would end up falling into. And of course he thinks that what Jesus is saying is that that's all wrong. The premise is wrong. You don't ask that question. You got to come at life and relationships in a different way. That is, we have to love because that's the right thing to do. We have to be self-sacrificing because that's what Christianity calls upon us to do. And he even deepens this. He says, if I love other people because of the classification, then I'm treating them not as a person, but a thing. As I said at the beginning, I finally get to the conflict in a way that's in the title today, persons versus things. And he says as soon as you label people, then they become not persons but things. And it gets even worse, he says, because then I will tend to love myself or care for myself because of my